And just making sure. All right. Just making sure we are on the page. Looking for the pop-up here. And there we are. I do see us live. Let me see.
Yes, we are.
Perfect.
Share it
All
too.
right. Good morning. Good morning to you. Good morning. Good morning to you. Good morning. Good morning. Won't you share with a friend or two?
Good morning
Good
to
morning. Good morning to you. You. Good morning. Good morning to you. And many more. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Black Table Talk. This is our Daring Dialogue session. This is season 15, episode 7, and we are here with a special guest on this morning. I want you to welcome Dr. Vanessa R. Brooks as I go ahead and introduce you to the dynamic powerhouse that she is. Dr. Vanessa R. Brooks is a faith based mental health consultant. She's an educator, a speaker, and author dedicated to bridging the gap between spirituality and mental wellness in the Black church. She holds a Doctor of Education in Mental Health Administration and a Master of Arts in Pastoral Counseling from Houston Christian University. She equips churches and faith based organizations with trauma informed strategies, mental health policy development, leadership wellness training, and crisis response planning through her consulting programs. As the author of two books that we're going to be talking about a little bit, she's going to be sharing with us today. As the author of When Faith Fails and Reclaiming Your Crown, a New Era of Resilience, Leadership, and Rest for Black Women, Dr. Brooks empowers churches and individuals navigating faith and mental health with her wisdom, with her compassion, with her empathy, with her boldness. Beyond her work in the mental health capacity and ministry, she is a devoted wife. She is a loving mother, a very proud grandmother, and dedicated fur baby parent, bringing both her professional expertise and personal warmth to everything that she does. I want you to give a warm welcome to Dr. Brooks in the chat. You can give us some applause or some claps or put some hearts on the screen. Dr. Brooks, welcome to the space.
Thank you so much for having me, Prophet Shante. I appreciate it. It's been a long time coming. I've been
It
waiting to get on Black Table Talk.
it has, and it's been a matter of our schedules meeting at the
Oh,
same place, because I have, I would say we've been internet friends, right? And we
years.
have followed each other's ministry and each other's professional roles at some point throughout what I would say since about maybe 2016,
Hmm.
2017.
Hmm.
So I have been really inspired, Dr. Brooks, not just by your professional work, but by your transparency. And I think that that is what is going to come through in today's conversation, just your transparency and your desire to help humanity at large, and not just a small segment of humanity, but really what you offer is something for all of humanity. And so I'm excited to hear about these books, and we're going to hop right in. I do want to make sure that I put your information up here. So let me make sure that I'm doing that. As we are talking today, if you're interested in taking a look at some of the programs and trainings that Dr. Vanessa Brooks offers, you can hop over to her website and take a look as well. I know many of you operate with multiple devices at one time, so I'm putting that information up there. And also, if you'd like to donate to the work of Dr. Brooks, her information for donation is there. She does a lot of teaching. She was doing Hillman University way before Hilltop and Hillman University, and so she has been on these platforms for many years now, teaching, empowering, and setting people free with education. Okay, and with the practical walkthrough of how to get free. So I'm encouraging you today, donate to her, check out her website, order her products, download the trainings and the teachings so that you can get started on your own personal journey. So our first question here is, how did your background lead you to your groundbreaking research? I know you can't tell it all, but just give us some of your background about how you got started in the type of research that you're doing.
Absolutely. My journey into this work has been deeply personal and professionally driven. I spent years in pastoral leadership, and I also spent in the professional arena 20 years in human services work, social work. And so I've witnessed firsthand the silent suffering of Black people, specifically. My work focuses on churchgoers because that's where we hang out at. You know, that's been a place of restoration for Black people. But I saw firsthand Black people in the church battling depression, anxiety, and trauma, both as a pastor and a traveling evangelist. And so what I witnessed was us basically telling these people to just pray about it. And I think it's because that's all we've known to say, really. And for too long, our community has been conditioned to see mental health struggles as a sign of spiritual weakness rather than a real treatable condition. And so I think that disconnect is what led to my doctoral research, where I explored the intersection of faith and mental health and cultural trauma in the Black church. And so I wanted to understand why depression is often spiritualized but not systematized, meaning we acknowledge suffering in our prayers, but we rarely create structures within the church to provide real mental health support. And so my research confirmed what I had already seen in ministry, and that is that um, Black Americans have unique barriers to mental health care. And these barriers were largely or are largely shaped by cultural history, religious beliefs, and systemic distrust of medical institutions. And so my work aims to bridge the gap between faith and mental health by helping churches build trauma informed mental health integrated ministries where healing isn't just prayed about, but is actively pursued through systems. So my motto is prayer and systems.
That, I mean, you articulated that so well. Prayer and systems. Now, I do remember hearing you talk a little bit about your research and some of the participants in your study. Can you
Mhm.
share a little bit about what you were finding out as you began to interview your participants? Sort of who were they,
Yes.
and what was the common thread that you were finding in your
Mm.
research?
Yes. So I was in a a mental health administration program, and um, it was an educational and mental health program. And most of my cohort went to interview people in the educational arena, but me, being the black sheep that I am, I asked my doctoral chair if I could go a different direction because a lot of people don't realize, but the church is considered what we call a helping profession, like therapy
Mhm.
and social. So he said, sure, that's fine. And because I've always had an interest in just understanding the Black church. So I interviewed Black or African American evangelical pastors in the state of North Carolina. Um, so it was what we call a qualitative experimental research study. And so I wanted to know from them what their thoughts were about integrating their religious counseling practices with evidence-based practices. And what I found was several things, but the key thing was that they really, I was actually surprised. They really wanted to integrate the two,
Mm-hmm.
But there were so many barriers that posed a problem, and the main barrier was theology. Of course, it was how they interpret the Bible.
Mm-hmm.
But the thing that I thought was really interesting was their own admission of their own mental health issues. I was so surprised that these pastors were willing to be so intimate with me and transparent in their own journeys. They talked about their own depression battles. They talked about their own suicide ideations. They talked about the enormous stress, the anxiety they were experiencing, the immense pressure, and then just the torment of feeling like they had their their hands full with trying to serve and help people and not knowing how. They wanted to quit, many of them. There was one of my participants who even talked about preaching while being an atheist for a season in her life. Um, so it was a very heavy conversation. And so what I did was I interviewed them first to get their perspectives. And then I did an experiment, which was I brought them all together on a call and I did a faith based mental health training with them. And what blew my mind was that the training actually changed their perspectives. Like they did a 360 because I
Mm-hmm.
showed them in the Bible how God really does care about us holistically.
Mm-hmm.
So I used the story of Elijah and just kind of walked them through how God used more of a biopsychological and spirituality approach to help Elijah. So it proved to me what I already knew is that pastors are suffering silently and they really can't help the people because they themselves need help first.
Mm. Yeah.
They want to help the people, but they are struggling, they are suffering, and the pressure to be, anointed and to be God's servant outweigh their need to pursue their own help. So it's just multi-layered, and but it also gave me the information to build out programs that I know can help pastors based on the findings.
And well, we both come from a faith background. I myself am also I'm an ordained elder.
Hmm.
So that's not something that, I go around and wear as a label.
Hmm.
But I would ask the question, did you find that these pastors or these spiritual leaders might have been dealing with what I'd like to call a God complex? Meaning that rather than presenting the faith to people, that they took on the role of savior. Was that?
Absolutely. Absolutely. 100%. And I talked about that briefly in the dissertation research was that and I don't think it's malicious.
Mhm.
I don't think it's an intentional desire to do that, but there's something about how we have been taught and trained, or the lack
Uh-huh.
of training, because one of the other findings that came out was a lot of the pastors talked about their lack of training. Like nobody really trains pastors on how to be pastors. So yeah, there was definitely this sort of God complex, this savior complex, where these pastors were trying to fulfill the role of God. And as a former pastor, I can relate because I did that too. So absolutely saw that a lot in this study.
Awesome. So I want you to tell us a little bit about, or talk to us about, your subsequent books that have come as a result of your research.
Yeah, so as I was conducting my research, I realized that people needed more than just theory, because research is a lot about theory. But what I
Mhm.
realized is that people need a roadmap. And that's what led to my books. The first book, When Faith Fails, was written for people who are struggling with the collapse of faith under the weight of suffering. It addresses religious trauma, which is a fairly new concept, and it's almost a non existent concept in the Black church. But the book also addresses the stigma of depression in faith spaces and the isolation that oftentimes comes with when faith no longer feels like enough for people. And this is happening more than I think people realize in the Black church. And so my
Mhm.
book provides practical tools to help people navigate faith crises, heal from spiritual wounds, and reclaim their belief systems in a way that aligns with their mental and emotional well-being. And it's not only based on the research; it's based on my own journey through that exact trauma. And then my second book, Reclaiming Your Crown, It's a continuation of that conversation, but through the lens of resilience and rest and leadership restoration, especially for Black women in faith spaces. The book speaks to the emotional labor we carry as Black women, the burnout we endure, and how we can unlearn toxic narratives of servitude and step into a more healthier and whole, empowered version of leadership. So I think both of my books tell people, they don't tell people to abandon faith. And I really want to make sure that people hear this really clearly, because the book When Faith Fails, I think people, because the title is very bold and daring,
And
there's a lot of,
can you share? Can you hold those up for us?
absolutely. So this is the first book, The Secret's Out, When Faith Fails, the Role of the Black Church, based on research, data, and my own personal lived experience. But these books, this book, neither book, and this is the one, Reclaiming Faith, neither of these books are about abandoning faith, people of God. Please hear that. The books are about how to heal within our faith. And if necessary, for some people, it's about how to reconstruct your faith in a way that doesn't break us. So, I would really suggest getting both of the books. When people actually purchase the books, they've been so blessed and so pleasingly surprised. Um, so they really are tools of restoration for us as Black people, and it's really a tool to help us restore our spirituality and not take it away from us at all.
And I think what you said, and I'm going to go back to the one of the initial things that we talked about at the beginning of this talk, and that is prayer and systems, or what I like to call spiritual tools and practical systems.
Yes.
Because for so long, and we've been having this sort of debate here on my page, um, the line dancing song, right? Where them fans at?
Yes.
That is making its rounds around social media. So many African Americans, particularly, are connecting with that song in terms of de-stressing, relieving stress. And so there was a meme that went around that said, America's falling apart, but Black people are looking for fans and doing line dances.
Mm-hmm.
And some people took it as sort of a jovial thing, right? But on the other hand, some people are like, oh, this is Black people bypassing again. And so, what I tried to make people understand in that moment, like you said, because we have so many ties historically to trauma in this country, I'm like, listen, in case you didn't know, Black people have been practicing somatic healing for as long as we've been in this nation. You know,
Absolutely.
and so that movement of the body to release trauma has been a part of our ethos as a people. So I don't mock us when
Mhm.
I see us either in a church context of shouting, right? Or in the social cultural context of a line dance. In both of those contexts, Black people are moving trauma out of their body.
That's right.
And so if you don't understand that, you will look at it and you will mock Black culture,
Mm-hmm.
and you'll say, "Oh, we just have our head in the sand and we don't know what's going on." No, some frameworks have been carried over to us generationally, and we may not understand all the theory behind our framework, but we are doing it. And so I think it's the work that you're doing is so powerful because you're helping spiritual leaders make the connection between what they have been told to do
Mm-hmm.
versus the why do we do it?
Why?
And
Exactly.
how can I integrate this system in? How can I begin to help my fellow parishioners, whatever religious context they're in? How can I begin to give them systems that's going to move them past just the feeling, doing what feels right in the body, to
Mm-hmm.
what's the science behind it?
Exactly.
Why does this work? And
Exactly.
then you're creating a system that they can continue to work through. So it's not just the system for the moment. And that's
Exactly.
the thing that really I'm excited to see with your work. My next question is, and we're kind of leading into this question, how can Black Americans begin to heal from traumatic religious experience?
Oh, goodness. So, healing from religious trauma requires a multi-layered approach. Um, Black Americans in particular face just deeply ingrained cultural and historical ties to religion. So healing isn't just about moving forward, it's also about untangling the past without losing ourselves in the process. And what I learned is that we have a very deep tie to our faith. And I think in the early days of me trying to do this work, I'm growing in what that methodology looks like. And I was being almost sort of dogmatic about it in the early days because I did not understand how to communicate my research to the audience. And so I learned there's really like three key things that have to happen to help us heal from the trauma. First, I think we have to acknowledge and name the trauma. Many of us were raised in environments where questioning faith was just seen as rebellion. And so I think the first step has to be helping faith leaders and Black believers in general, um, giving them permission, helping them understand it's okay to say that this hurt me. That does not mean that you don't have faith or that you don't believe. It's giving you permission to say what hurt you. And so naming that wound is necessary to begin the healing process. And the church and church leaders are going to have to learn how to make space for that in their churches, which is why I talk so much about, trauma informed spaces. The second thing is we have to learn how to rebuild our community without faith, without fear. Healing doesn't always, it shouldn't even have to ever mean abandoning faith. It does mean that we have to deconstruct harmful beliefs. And so one of the difficult challenges is helping people to understand what deconstructing means. Now, I
Mhm.
have to kind of distance myself from that whole deconstructing conversation and community because a lot of those people were taking things, to an extreme that I wasn't trying to go to. My journey is based on research and my lived experience, but we have to deconstruct the harmful beliefs, and somehow do that while keeping our faith and traditions intact, and that's difficult.
Mhm.
Black Americans can reclaim their spirituality, and that's what these books talk about. I talk about this a lot, what you just explained in terms of the line dancing, and so we have to also decolonize our faith because our Black heritage and our Black culture has been whitewashed in our faith, and so everything that's Black, everything that's Black centric, is
Mhm.
almost demonized by our own people. So part of this journey is restoring um, an appreciation for our own Black culture, and we're going to have to do that with patience and education. To
I'm gonna have to just hold my hands up there because I just felt that
in
in my spirit.
Shoshana, yeah, yeah, and so that's one of the most difficult parts of this journey for me is, and my desire is to help the Black church. For a while, I strayed away from the Black church because of my own trauma, but God has made it very clear to me that this is where I'm supposed to be. These are the people that I'm called to help, and I have to use a level of patience and wisdom to be able to do that. So we need more of our ancestral culture back in the Black church,
Mhm.
and we need less. Oh God, we need less white supremacy in our faith. We need less white identity in our faith. One of the things that I've been doing for the last 6 years is decolonizing my whiteness. A lot of you may not understand that. It's something that you won't understand until you understand it. So there's this disentanglement of whiteness from our consciousness that has to happen. And again, it's going to require patience and education for that to happen. So we want to be able to support this journey of mental and emotional well-being, without the shame, without the guilt, and without isolating people. So rebuilding without fear. And then the final step that I've come to understand, is that we need to integrate evidence-based practices with our spiritual practices. They can coexist. Okay, we don't have to choose. It's not binary. It's not either or. You can have therapy and Jesus. Okay, you can have therapy and speak in tongues. So spiritual practices can coexist with evidence-based practices. That's the message that I'm really trying to convey. All the things that we love doing in the Black church, laying hands, prophesying, shouting, all the things. Let's keep them all, but let's also integrate room for emotional and mental wellness. They're not enemies. They're on the same team. And so that's how we began to heal from the traumatic religious experiences. And the final thing I would say is this is the probably the toughest, is we're gonna have to deconstruct the theology. Now
Mhm.
I ain't quite figured out how that's gonna happen yet because we believe it, whatever we believe. But what I do know is I do bring neuroscience into my work a lot.
Mhm.
And I bring psychology into the work a lot because I need people to understand how powerful our brain is and how beliefs are hardwired into the brain, into the nervous system, which makes it very difficult to change belief systems. So a lot of my work is rooted in something called neuroplasticity, where I have to teach people how to go about rewiring their mind. Now, this is biblical. The Bible says, be transformed by the renewing of the mind. I think the Bible stopped, though, at giving us the how to's. And because I believe God still speaks to us, I don't think God stopped speaking when the Bible was published. I think God still speaks to people, and I think God still gives us wisdom. And so I think what God has given me is the wisdom to implement the how to's of the scripture. And if the church can just accept that the sciences of psychology and neuroscience and all these other sciences are the how to's of the scripture, then we're going to have a winning formula. So, what my work does is integrate scripture with the how to's of the sciences, if that makes sense.
It makes absolute sense. Um, I think for me, when you talk about deconstructing theology, my deconstruction began back in 2012, but I didn't really start getting into a thorough practice of it, I would say, until 2016. And one of the reasons why we even have this platform right here, Black Table Talk, was because of a divine call and a divine challenge to begin to look at the ways in which we see blackness, look at the ways in which we see spirituality. And so a lot of the work that I'm sitting in right now was based on an obedience to move away from the theology that was harmful.
Mm.
And one of the ways that I began to do that was through open study. I had been doing study privately, but it was no, let people into what you're reading, let people into what you're studying. So I began by reading aloud books about religious faith, religious practice, faith beliefs all over the world, and really help having people to begin to interrogate what they believed and why. Where did these systems come from? Who was originating it? Why was it originated? Are there common threads? And so that was a part of my deconstructing, but I was doing it through reading aloud,
Yeah, I
right?
remember
Somebody
because I was on those videos with you a lot of times.
And people were looking at me like, what is this lady talking about? Why are we talking about this? But that was sort of how my walkthrough and my open questioning began for me. So when you talk about our beliefs being hardwired, they absolutely are. And then understanding, like you said, with neuroplasticity, there's an opportunity to change your mind. I often say to people, I am open to changing my mind when the facts change. And if
Yes.
we understand science, science is always helping us to understand that things are ever changing, things are evolving. What we knew in the past is not what we know now. We on some things, right? Your elders would say, when you know better, Maya Angelou said, when you know better, you do better, right?
Right,
You
Coach
don't
Jackie.
condemn and beat yourself up about what you just didn't know, but once you know better, you begin to evolve and you begin to do better. One of my running jokes here on this page, and it just cracks people up, is when I talk about Jesus, and I tell people, listen, I am aware that America has two Jesuses running alongside each other. You know, I say Jesus Tariq Christ.
Yes, you do.
Jesus Tariq Christ. That's who I talk to. But we do have a segment of our nation that is thoroughly invested in Kenny Loggins Christ. And you
Absolutely.
can't tell them otherwise. You can't tell them that Kenny Loggins Christ is not real. But again, that goes back to what you said about how our beliefs are hardwired.
Mm-hmm.
They're hardwired
And
through our culture.
it's intentional. It's intentional. I tell people all the time, I said, listen, go to Google and type in the word Jesus or type in the word God. Okay.
Hmm.
And you can see the intentionality of how this country has used iconography, images
Hmm.
to brainwash us.
Yes.
Okay. I am from the South, and right now, my aunt left my family her property. I own three sets of property to my ancestors, right? And at her house right now, to this day, there's a picture. No disrespect to my aunt. I love my aunt. I'm trying to make a point here. But to this day,
Mhm.
there's a picture of the Last Supper on her wall with all the
Mhm.
white characters. All the disciples white. All Jesus is white.
Mhm.
All my relatives, my ancestors, my aunts, my grandmas, even my mama's house, they all had white Jesus at the house.
Mhm.
But it's not their fault. This is
Right.
what this is what I it's a form of psychological warfare
Yes.
to convince you psychologically
Mhm.
that God is white is the ultimate act of enslavement. Because
Mhm.
if the higher power, if the highest power is white, a white male, that is going to automatically reduce you to the role of servant and slave. So um, part of the journey in the conversation is going to have to be around, even though it's so crazy because the Bible, if we actually did Bible studies,
Mhm.
you can just see geographically that Jesus could not be, be a white skinned person. But that just goes to show the power of indoctrination and psychological warfare. um,
Mhm.
and so I also talk a lot about just epigenetics and Dr. Jordy Grice's work about post-traumatic slave syndrome, and a lot of these beliefs have just been handed down to us for
Yes.
centuries. And so this is why they kept our ancestors from reading books and being educated. They wouldn't even let them read certain parts of the Bible, so they wouldn't put the pieces of the puzzle together. They didn't know our
Yes.
ancestors were smarter than them, though. They'd go down into the woods and they'd read it anyway.
Mhm.
So it's just it's a lot of work that has to be done. And what God is doing with me is first had to heal and restore me, and it's going to require a level of patience and a level of prophetic brilliance to to engage with my audience. But I see a turn. Like, I really do see improvement. More pastors and more churches are starting to follow my work. They're starting to
Mhm.
hire me. They're buying my products and programs. So it's working. I think what you're doing is brilliant. Um, you know, Sometimes we have to do it without saying that we're doing it.
Mhm.
So I think what you're doing is brilliant.
And again, that integrating evidence-based practices with our spiritual practice. Now,
Yes.
when you start talking iconography, you're all in my lane because my degree is in art education, and so I try to address things that I see visually
Mm-hmm.
by bringing people visual truths. And so I try to attack it from the arts angle. um, and so I think that has been helpful. I try to help people to understand the history of it's 1611, and King James is creating his new world. He's creating his new world by the text. He's taking spiritual text and he is superimposing the slave and the serf and the serfdom on top of that. And then you have 1619, you have the 20 Africans that arrive in Virginia as indentured servants, not as enslaved, but as indentured servants.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm trying to help people make the connection. How do we get from 1611, this new text that highlights enslavement of all peoples that are not white, right? How do we connect that to the Catholic edicts that come out in the
Mm-hmm.
1500s to
Mm-hmm.
now 1619? You have this group of people coming over, and you have the exploration with a new text, and a text, as you said, that God is now white.
Mm-hmm.
Because if God is white, and white people are in the image of God, then who are you in the
Who are
image of?
you? Exactly.
And so
Right.
we've had centuries of this question of who are you in the image of God. And so people get upset when you know who you are.
Hmm. Listen, I know it. I know it.
And when you refuse this idea and this image that you are less than,
Hmm.
when you understand that you are made in the image of the creator, the almighty, the all-knowing, the all of in all, as some people call him,
Hmm.
right? They might not say Jesus, they might say the creator of all things, the
That's
creator of
right.
life. um I don't harp on what people call them. I just want to know, do you understand your own divinity?
That's
Do you
exactly right.
understand your own divinity? And when you do, that angers some people. When you start reclaiming your spirituality, when you
Hmm.
start colonizing your faith,
Yes,
and your method and your writings have been transforming people's lives. And so that's
absolutely.
why I have you here today. And again, check out her website. If you want to, again, donate to her work, the information is here. I know we have to start wrapping up. Um, what has been your biggest challenge with integrating these practices into faith spaces? What's been your biggest challenge?
It's heartbreaking to say my biggest challenge, unfortunately, has not been with the white community. Um, my biggest challenge has been with my own community, but I understand it. I think initially I was hurt and angry that my own people were rejecting the work.
Mhm,
But again, I understand it because this is hundreds of years of psychological indoctrination, and I understand what happens to our nervous system when it is wired, to believe. And I understand inherited trauma, and I understand that traumatic beliefs and experiences are handed down genetically. So we are born in our DNA with this wiring for survival, and this wiring for a belief that we are less than. And so I have to. The biggest challenge has been breaking through all of those deeply ingrained cultural resistances that I've experienced with my own people. Um, because in the Black church, we do tend to treat mental health as either a spiritual failure or a demonic attack.
mhm,
It's so binary. There's very little room for the work that I do. Many leaders see depression as a lack of faith, and they see mental health discussions as worldly. I mean, even in my dissertation research, a lot of the pastors would just tell me point blank, to them it was just worldly and secular, and that there was no place for that in God, the things of God. So um, even though scripture supports wisdom and healing and seeking counsel, but again, this is what we mean by psychological warfare, when the mind has been induced
mhm,
um, to believe something. It doesn't really matter what evidence exists. It is very difficult to get people to change their mind. I study change theory to help me in my work, and it's one of the most difficult things to do is to get a person to change their beliefs, even if you have evidence that
mhm,
supports a new belief. So the
mhm,
greatest challenge for me is just getting people to change what they fundamentally believe. And
mhm,
again, that's going to require, a level of brilliance. And God has been showing me, some very strategic ways uh, to deal with that. So I think that's the biggest challenge, is just getting past those cultural stigmas and those theological blocks. Um,
mhm,
again, the Black church has historically been a refuge for us. It's a place of community, a social hub. It's been a survival mechanism for Black people. So when we come and try to introduce something that's perceived as new,
mhm,
like trauma informed ministry, a lot of
mhm,
Black people see it as a threat to the church's traditional role. I was
mhm,
very confused in the beginning because I was like, why is there so much resistance? But they saw my work as a threat. So God
mhm,
had me ask people for about 6 months. I stopped teaching, and I just started asking pastors and Christians, like, why are you resistant to what I'm saying? And they would tell me they felt like I was, trying to take their faith or take their church. And so I learned a lot from those conversations. And so What I've learned to do now is to frame mental health and emotional well-being and religious trauma and deconstruction through a lens of biblical principles and historical context. And I have
Mhm.
found that more leaders are open to the conversation when I do it that way. It's about showing them that integrating mental health and integrating historical context is not an attack on their faith, but it actually enhances their faith. So it's just learning how to not make them feel threatened, making them feel safe. And I've found that they're way more open when they feel safe. Um, so yeah, the challenge is, it's both theological and cultural.
Mhm. I hope that people who are listening today, I hope they're taking in what you're saying, because um, this is a this is a expansive topic, right? We can't possibly cover all of the aspects, which is why I'm encouraging people to get your books, because they are more in depth in terms of
Hmm.
the research portion. Um, One thing that you said there is that getting people to see that this is not an attack on their faith, but an enhancement. I don't know, I can't recall what year it was, but as I was reading, most people know the story of Jesus and the woman at the well. It's a pretty well-known story in terms of, people see it from a social lens of her being an outcast. People see it about the question of her sexual history. People see the example of the disciples having to go away in order for Jesus to have this conversation with this woman, all of those different things. But as I began to look at the origin of the words, when Jesus began to talk to her, that word there is therapeuo.
Oh, don't do it, Prophet Shante.
And I said, wait a minute.
Therapeuo.
What
Yes.
is therapeuo?
My God.
And I went to the meaning of the word, and it was really talking about healing through talk.
Through talk.
I
Talk
said,
therapy.
oh, so I get it. Okay, Jesus was conducting a therapy session
Come on.
with the woman at the well.
Come on now.
And that was one of the things that helped me to have a light bulb come on, right? To make the connection between what we have been taught about the text versus what are some deeper things happening in the text. And so now when I hear the word therapy, I know that therapy is healing through talk.
Yes.
Okay? Some people are not may not get their healing through talk. They might get their healing through movement, which is what we talked about earlier with somatic healing.
Somatic. Yes.
Some people might get their healing through sound, okay? That's your people with music therapy and your people
Mm-hmm.
with the sound bowls. So
Mm-hmm.
there's modalities for healing, okay? But the point is we're all trying to get to healing.
That's right.
We're all trying to get to healing. And so I'm not going to knock you for the path that you took to get to healing. If it took talking it out for you, then talk it out.
That's
Now,
right.
I will say, when people say, well, how does this connect to what often happens in the Black church? Testimony time. Do you
Mm-hmm.
know how many people would have blown a gasket if they couldn't come into the religious context
Mm-hmm.
on a Friday night or a Thursday night or a midweek night and be able to
Mm-hmm.
get up and release through talk?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so that's something, again, this is a practice that we've seen in the religious context. And so
Well,
I might not have a tambourine, doctor, but I might be on a couch. Does
exactly.
does that make my healing less valid?
Exactly. I think that's the thing that, research and studying is a powerful thing because you will come to find, which is why my dissertation was, I think, so groundbreaking, was that because what I learned is that, oh, when I do education, it will change perspectives, right? We're doing these things anyway. Now, I've been a Christian all my life, but I'm also a Reiki certified Reiki healer, and some people think that's whatever, demonic or whatever. until you go study the practice. These are things that we're doing anyway. It's laying on of hands. We've been laying on of hands for
Mm-hmm.
forever.
Your
So,
mother, your
yeah,
grandmother, your elder.
listen, my mama used to do something called the lifting. Okay, it's probably a hoodoo tradition, but she never used the word hoodoo. But she did so many things. My mother could heal my migraines just by taking her hand and she would just hold it over my forehead, just like this, and she just lift
Mhm.
up and she lift up and she lift up. In a few minutes, my migraine was gone. We've been doing these things anyway, but I think again, when we talk about the power of conditioning the mind through indoctrination and programming.
Mhm.
This is what we have to decolonize and deconstruct, because when you decolonize and take the whiteness out of your faith and
Mhm.
return back to your culture, you're going to see you're doing these things anyway. So everything that we consider to be evidence-based practice, because if you think about it, y'all know the mental health industry and as well as the medical industry, they all stole their practices from Black culture. Okay, I'm just saying, y'all.
Mhm.
And like they always do, they misappropriate our culture. And so these are things that we do anyway. We do these things anyway. So somatic healing, a lot of us think that that's wrong too. Y'all, we shout in church, we dance, we hug. Like touch therapy is a real thing. We hugging each other anyway in church. So one of the
Mhm.
things that I'm doing is trying to educate the Black community to say, hey, you're already doing evidence-based practice, which is why I have the mental health consulting program where I'm teaching systems. Now we can't do certain things because we're not licensed in the church, but a
Right.
lot of the things you can do through what we call mental health support. You don't have to
Mhm.
have a license to provide mental health support and advocacy. And so, just teaching pastors and lay members how to cancel. I have something called the Pastoral and Congregational Care Toolkit that I'm selling, and it teaches things such as how to do lay counseling, right? How do you talk to a person in the church, even though you don't have a license to do it? There is something called um, lay counseling. So, just these are things that we're doing anyway. Praying for somebody can be a form of talk therapy,
Mhm.
right? It's words, it's conversation. So
Mhm.
for us, it's going to just be a matter of, again, educating our people to connect the dots to say, you're not outside of the will of God. You're not displeasing God if you practice evidence based practices, because these are things that you were doing anyway. You just didn't know to call it that.
Mhm.
Reiki is something you were doing anyway. You were already laying hands on people's minds. You already
Mhm.
laying hands on people's heads. You just didn't know to call it that because you called it laying on of hands. So a lot of it is just there is a gap in the knowledge, because we are so married to our tradition, and we're so married to, I'm gonna get in trouble here, we're married to our white consciousness and faith that we've lost sight of ourselves. And so my books, both of them, have sections on Black spiritual practices that we need to return to.
Mhm.
um, Things that we're really doing anyway, like drumming. You already got a set of drums in your church,
Right.
right? Grounding. If anyone who grew up in the South, we already walk outside with no shoes on anyway. I was
Right.
raised to do that. I just didn't know that there was a medicinal value in that. So things
Mhm.
that you already have access to and are doing anyway. But now I want to teach you that there's a science behind that and
Mhm.
explain how those practices can be used to heal. So I think that's the game changer there.
And I want to say this. Uh, my co-conspirators, my white followers, I don't want you to take offense to what I'm about to say, okay? But it is true, okay? If you'll be honest, those of you who are watching, because I know y'all watch everything black people do. So don't act like you're not hearing this part of the conversation. White people, if I can say anything about white people are good with language around what black people are already doing.
Yes.
They are good for putting language and framing to what black people are already doing.
Yes.
The problem comes when you try to whitewash and repackage and hand me back what my ancestors has already been doing. See, now
Exactly.
you're playing in my face.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And that's what
And
they
so
that's everything. And
So
that's why I'm trying to get people to go back into the mental health and arena, because y'all, we were already practicing mental health anyway. But I digress.
so doctor, I want to say this about your work. You might have to put together, a chart that says black faith practices, what they are currently called, because sometimes people just need to see the visual that this is what this is.
I think I'll do that.
Laying on of hands is Reiki.
I
And
think I'll do
again, with language, right? I had somebody the other day tell me the word universe, the word frequency, the word energy is evil.
that. Me too.
I said, wait a minute now. If you go look up the word universe, okay? The word universe means one verse or one turn. What did Moses do when he was before God? He said, well, God said to him, I'm going to turn and I'm going to allow you to see my backside.
Hmm.
You can't look at me. If you look at me fully, you won't be able to survive this. So I'm going to turn one time and I'm allow you to see my backside. In other words, I'm going to allow you to see the history of the world. I'm going to allow you to see what has been. Is not the study of the universe the study of the history of the world and the galaxy and what has been and what's
Yes.
thousands and millions of light years away? I'm just saying, we just have to do our own study and not just take a word and take what somebody says about that word and immediately attribute it to something evil or to something
Right.
bad. I
That's
know we got to wrap up. Final
right.
question. Final question. And we didn't get to all the questions. It's okay. But final question here. What would you, what are your considerations for faith leaders and mental health practitioners in light of your research? What are some things they need to consider if they're going to be working with Black people when it comes to their mental health?
So what came out of my dissertation research was monumental in helping me understand, and I hope that it will help other people understand. Faith leaders and mental health professionals both have to understand that religion is not just a belief system for Black Americans. It is a part of our cultural DNA. All right,
Mm,
I want y'all to hear me good. It is a part of our cultural DNA. So if you try to strip it away, you're gonna get a black eye. Okay. That's the first thing. So quickly, just three considerations: intergenerational trauma. Faith leaders and mental health professionals have to understand that, because many of our religious beliefs are shaped by survival-based theology that's been passed down from enslaved ancestors, and even more recently, faith was used as both a tool for resistance by our ancestors, but faith was also used as a tool of control by the slave masters, right? And so
yeah.
there's both of those layers that have to be, unpacked, because both of those layers still impact us today. And then faith leaders and mental health professionals have to understand the distrust in mental health systems. The Black community has historically been harmed by medical institutions. You got the Tuskegee experiments. You got Black women dying in childbirth, racial biases in healthcare. You got misdiagnosis across the board. So this makes integrating mental health into church spaces even more necessary, but also more challenging, because many will only seek help if they trust the source. So this is why I need pastors and churches to help me get the people to trust the source. But I also need mental health professionals to provide culturally sensitive practices. So I'm in the process right now of creating a program that's going to be uh, available for continuing education credits for mental health professionals, so they can become more culturally informed and provide culturally sensitive care for Black people. And then finally, spirituality versus psychological interpretation. I think many Black Americans interpret trauma through spiritual warfare rather than through psychological lenses. If I can get the church and mental health professionals to understand trauma through the Black experience, so instead of saying you're depressed, they won't say that in the Black community. They'll say the enemy is attacking you. So again, this is about language barriers. We have to work through the language barriers and help faith leaders understand how language impacts whether we make a decision to get mental health treatments or not. I'm finished. I had to say it really fast.
Man, let me tell you something. I hope that people who are watching this conversation today, I hope that you come away from this conversation with a greater understanding of integration of spirituality and the psychological lens. For so long, people have made these things enemies of each other. For so long, you've had spiritual communities attacking psychological communities.
Mm-hmm.
When the reality is, when synergized, when synergized,
Powerful.
they become a powerful force
Powerful.
in healing. Because ultimately, almost like MLK versus Malcolm X enthusiasts, their goal, their both heart's desire was to get people free, Black people free,
Mm-hmm.
Black people, economically relieved. They both had the same goal. They might have had different methodologies. And so now, 50 years later, right? Now people can see how they could have worked together, but there were external forces, right? Keeping that from happening. Because we know better, remember, because we know better, we do better. So, what do these two communities need to start doing? They need to start talking to each other rather than at each other. It's
Yeah,
time to synergize because if the goal is healing, then it's time to synergize. We
that's right.
may not be able to agree on every single point, but those points where we might be running parallel, but at some point there are points where we intersect. And in those places where we intersect, let's get together, let's have those conversations, let's make healing happen. Let's make healing a possibility for not just the soul, but also the body, but also the mind. Martin Luther King said it this way when he talked about the issues in America. He said I'm out to save Black men's bodies and white men's souls.
Mm-hmm.
That's something he said that has been sticking with me in my mind this week. But we're out to save bodies and souls. Psychologically, right? The profession is really working on the soul of man, the mind of humanity, healing the mind. Spiritually, you got spiritual leaders that say these souls got to be saved, right? But what happens when those two things come together? You get
Powerful.
a holistic approach. You get a nation that becomes a healed nation. And we know with so much happening right now that this is an imperative. This is an imperative. What we're seeing, I know you're covering it right now from the African American perspective, but what we're seeing and what we are all living through right now in the United States is the soul and mind sickness that has gone unaddressed in our nation. We're literally living through what happens when the soul and the mind is
Yep.
not addressed.
Yep.
Everybody pays for it.
Yep.
Everybody pays for it. So, last question, doctor, and you've got about a minute to answer here before we have to sign out. What do you see for the future of mental health in the study of faith-based and religious trauma? Where do you see it going in the future?
I think we're going to need more research on how both intergenerational and religious trauma influences faith-based mental health struggles. I think there are going to be more conversations around this. I think it's a prophetic study from the religious or from the spiritual perspective. But we need more research on how generational and religious trauma is impacting the African American experience. We're going to need more structured trauma informed training for pastors and churches, which is something that I'm working on. And we're going to need some increased focus on Black women in leadership and their unique stressors in faith spaces. I think those are the three areas that we're going to see um, more research and more work and greater outcomes.
Awesome. Well, I want to thank you today for your time. Thank you for your attention. Thank you for coming on this platform and having this very important conversation with us. I want to end by letting people know that light is the most daring opposition to any darkness, any evil, any trauma. And how we get to that light is what we've been talking about today. How do we integrate what we know about the mind and what we know about the spirit? How
Mm.
do we integrate those two things so that we can be the light that we need to be, not just for ourselves, but for our community, for our families? Wellness is what we're trying to get to: health, healing, and wellness, moving from harm to health. Dr. Again, I want to thank you.
How you doing,
Um,
man? Okay.
thank you for your time. And
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
I'm so honored by this conversation. Thank you all for tuning in. Please share this broadcast. It will be up on Facebook for 30 days. However, you will be able to see this broadcast again on our YouTube page. And I will put the link down once that is up. Thank you all so much for your time and attention. Be well, and most importantly, be light.